In the summer of 1971, the world woke up to something unthinkable. The United States, the richest nation on earth, was running out of gold. For decades, America had been the backbone of the global economy. After World War II, the Bretton Woods system fixed every major currency to the US dollar, and the dollar was tied to gold at $35 an ounce. It was order. It was stability. It was certainty. But beneath that confidence was a secret the US was terrified to face. America had promised more gold than it actually had. To fund the Cold War, the Vietnam War, Europe's reconstruction, global military bases, and a booming consumer economy, Washington printed dollars faster than gold was flowing into its vaults. Other nations noticed. France demanded gold. Britain demanded gold. Switzerland demanded gold. Dollars rushed out. Gold drained away. Confidence cracked. For the first time in modern history, the world saw the dollar not as a treasure, but as a liability. By 1971, America faced a crisis that could destroy its economy, its military reach, and its global power in a single blow. If nations continued demanding gold for their dollars, the U.S. would go bankrupt, publicly, humiliatingly, catastrophically. President Nixon confronted a problem no American leader had ever faced. How do you run an empire when the money behind it is collapsing? And so, on August 15th, Nixon did something no one expected, something radical, something irreversible. He went on television and ended the gold standard. With one announcement, the US dollar was no longer backed by anything. Not gold, not silver, not metal, only trust. The world panicked. Currencies swung wildly. Inflation exploded. Oil prices surged. The global economy convulsed, and America realized something terrifying. Without gold, nobody had to use the dollar anymore. If countries abandoned the dollar, the US wouldn't just face inflation. It would lose its superpower status. The world had entered a monetary vacuum. The old system was dead, and nothing had replaced it. America needed a new anchor, a new foundation for the dollar, something universal, something indispensable, something every nation would be forced to buy, something that couldn't be mined, printed, or substituted. And in the 1970s, only one commodity fit that description: oil. But oil was controlled by the Middle East, and the Middle East was about to weaponize it. What came next wasn't just economic history. It was the birth of a financial empire more powerful than gold, and more fragile than anyone realized. The petrodollar was about to be born. When the dollar lost its golden anchor in 1971, the world was already unstable. But in 1973, something happened that ripped the global economy open, not with bullets or bombs, but with oil. Because in the 1970s, oil wasn't just energy. It was civilization. It powered cars, ships, planes, factories, militaries, supply chains, global trade, every part of modern life. Oil wasn't a commodity. It was oxygen. And almost overnight, the people who controlled that oxygen realized their power. On October 6, 1973, the Yom Kippur War erupted in the Middle East. Israel fought Egypt and Syria. The United States supported Israel, and the Arab oil producers decided they would not let Washington intervene without consequences. So they flipped a switch the world didn't believe they would dare touch. They turned off the oil. The Arab members of OPEC announced an embargo. No oil to the United States, no oil to its allies, no oil to anyone supporting Israel. It was the first time in history energy was used as a geopolitical weapon. And it worked instantly. Oil prices quadrupled. Not doubled, quadrupled. Gas stations in America ran dry. Cars lined up for miles. Drivers slept in their vehicles waiting for fuel. Businesses shut down. Factories froze. Inflation exploded. The stock market plunged. Recession slammed the Western world like a hammer. America, the superpower of the post-war era, suddenly looked powerless. Europe panicked. Japan panicked. Even the Soviet Union braced for impact. For the first time in modern history, the balance of global power shifted away from the industrialized West and into the hands of a few Middle Eastern nations. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, UAE, Qatar, countries that had spent decades treated as developing or peripheral, now held the world by the throat. The message was clear: control oil, control the world. But the oil shock didn't just reveal OPEC's strength, it exposed America's weakness. Without gold backing the dollar, without stable energy prices, without control over global supply chains, the U.S. faced a crisis more dangerous than inflation. It faced irrelevance. Because if nations paid for oil in other currencies, the dollar would collapse. America's debt would explode. Its military reach would shrink. Its empire would evaporate, silently, slowly, and permanently. Washington understood the emergency. If America wanted to remain the world's superpower, it needed a new foundation. A new system that guaranteed the world would keep using the dollar. And there was only one country powerful enough, rich enough, and strategically positioned enough to make that happen: Saudi Arabia. The next chapter reveals the secret deal that saved the dollar and quietly reshaped global power for the next 50 years. By 1974, the United States was facing an economic nightmare. Inflation was ripping through the country. Oil prices were strangling the economy. The dollar, the backbone of global trade, was collapsing. America understood something terrifying. If the world stopped using the dollar for oil, the American century was over. And in that moment of crisis, Washington made a decision that would redefine global power for the next half-century. It went to Saudi Arabia. Not as a conqueror, not as a superpower, but as a negotiator. Because in the 1970s, Saudi Arabia had something America desperately needed: control over the world's most important resource. And America had something Saudi Arabia desperately wanted: protection. So the two nations sat down, behind closed doors, without press, without Congress, without public debate, and crafted one of the most consequential agreements in modern history. The deal was simple, brutal, and brilliant. Saudi Arabia would price all of its oil exclusively in US dollars. Not yen, not pounds, not Deutschmarks, not gold, only dollars. And in return, America would guarantee Saudi Arabia's security forever. U.S. weapons would flow into the kingdom. U.S. troops would protect the royal family. U.S. intelligence would shield the regime from coups, rivals, and internal threats. The House of Saud would become untouchable. In exchange, the dollar would become inescapable. Because if the world wanted oil, and the world always wants oil, it now needed dollars first. Countries from Japan to Germany to India to Brazil were suddenly forced to hold massive reserves of U.S. currency just to keep their economies alive. This was the birth of the petrodollar. But the genius of the deal didn't stop there. Saudi Arabia agreed to do something even more powerful: take its vast oil profits, its petrodollars, and reinvest them into U.S. Treasury bonds. In other words, Saudi Arabia would sell oil, receive dollars, and then loan those dollars right back to the United States. America got cheap financing. Saudi Arabia got security. The dollar got global supremacy. And the world got a system built on a secret handshake. No treaty, no vote, no announcement. Just two nations locking the global economy into a framework that still governs trade today. The consequences were immediate. Demand for U.S. dollars soared. American debt became the most desirable asset on earth. The dollar regained its throne, stronger than before, even without gold. The U.S. no longer needed metal to back its money. It had something far more powerful: oil. And from that moment on, the United States understood a truth it would never forget. If oil stays priced in dollars, America stays in charge. But maintaining that system would require something far more dangerous: a new kind of global strategy built not on economics, but on military power. And that strategy would define the next chapter of the modern world. Once the U.S.-Saudi deal was sealed, something extraordinary happened. Not with armies, not with treaties, not with revolutions, but with money. Because by forcing the world to buy oil in U.S. dollars, Washington didn't just rescue its currency, it rewired the architecture of global finance. Suddenly, every country, from Germany to Japan to India to Brazil, needed dollars. Not for trade, not for investment, not for savings, for survival. Without dollars, a nation couldn't power its factories. couldn't run its airlines, couldn't move its ships, couldn't sustain its military, couldn't keep its lights on. Oil became the beating heart of civilization, and the dollar became the blood that kept it alive. From that moment on, global demand for dollars was no longer optional, it was mandatory. And that single shift triggered a chain reaction across the world economy. First, the rise of U.S. Treasury bonds. Every country needed dollars, so every country bought U.S. debt. And every dollar that flowed out through oil imports flowed right back into Washington through bond purchases. America discovered a cheat code. The world paid for its oil, then loaned the money back to the U.S. government. Infinite demand, infinite recycling, infinite leverage. Treasuries became the safest, most liquid asset on the planet, not because America was fiscally responsible, but because the petrodollar system forced nations to trust it. Second, the explosion of U.S. banking power. With trillions of petrodollars flowing into American banks, Wall Street transformed from a national institution into a global empire. Banks now controlled international loans, corporate expansion, emerging market financing, currency markets, sovereign debt negotiations. The dollar wasn't just money anymore. It was an operating system, and Wall Street became its administrator. Third, America gained a new kind of geopolitical power. If every nation needed dollars and America controlled the supply, then Washington could reward allies, punish rivals, and shape global politics without firing a shot. Sanctions became weapons. SWIFT became a choke point. Dollar access became leverage. Countries learned the unspoken rule: obey the global order, or lose access to the global economy. Fourth, oil producers became financial giants. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, and Qatar weren't just selling energy. They were accumulating influence. Their sovereign wealth funds, built from petrodollar surpluses, became some of the largest investors in the world. They bought Western stocks, bonds, ports, skyscrapers, banks, and companies. The global elite list quietly shifted eastward. And finally, inflation escaped its old boundaries. With the dollar no longer tied to gold, but tied to oil demand, the U.S. discovered something almost mystical. It could print money without collapsing its currency, because the world would always need dollars. The petrodollar system didn't just stabilize America. It reshaped the global economy into a dollar-centric machine, one that rewarded the U.S., empowered oil states, and locked every other nation into dependence. But this new financial world came with a cost. To protect the petrodollar, the U.S. would need to protect the Middle East, with armies, alliances, covert deals, and wars. The next chapter reveals how dollars and oil turned America's military into the guardian of the global order, and the enforcer of a system built in secret. The petrodollar system solved America's greatest financial crisis, but it created a new obligation, one far more dangerous. The U.S. had to protect the oil, all of it, everywhere. Because if oil stayed stable, the dollar stayed dominant. If oil markets collapsed, the dollar collapsed with them. So after 1974, the United States didn't just become a Middle Eastern partner. It became the military guarantor of the entire region. Washington didn't announce this role. It acted on it. U.S. bases multiplied across the Gulf. American fleets patrolled the Persian Gulf and Red Sea. Fighter jets sat on runways from Bahrain to Qatar. CIA channels opened through every royal palace. This wasn't democracy. This wasn't ideology. This was infrastructure. A global military architecture built to protect a financial system. Every conflict in the Middle East after the 1970s had two layers: the public reason and the petrodollar reason. When Iran fell to revolution in 1979, America panicked, not just because of geopolitics, but because Iran was a major oil exporter. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, the U.S. didn't just defend a small nation, it defended access to the world's largest oil reserves. When Saudi Arabia faced internal threats, America acted instantly, because the House of Saud was the gatekeeper of dollar-priced oil. Countries learned the unspoken equation: threaten the oil, threaten the dollar, face the United States. And this force didn't require conquest. It required presence, bases, fleets, intelligence networks, arms deals, all forming a shield around the petrodollar system. But the military wasn't America's only weapon. Sanctions became the silent sword. If the dollar was the bloodstream of the global economy, sanctions were clots. They strangled nations without a single soldier crossing a border. Iraq, Iran, Libya, Venezuela, Russia. Each was cut off from the dollar, and each watched its economy collapse. This made America's power almost supernatural. No empire in history had this tool. Rome couldn't freeze bank accounts. Britain couldn't shut down trade with a signature. Spain couldn't starve economies thousands of miles away. The United States could, because the dollar wasn't just a currency. It was a permission slip. Access granted. Access denied. The petrodollar created a world where military force and monetary power fused into a single strategy. A global architecture where maintaining oil stability meant maintaining U.S. primacy. But every system built in secret eventually faces a test. And today, new powers, China, Russia, India, BRICS nations, are challenging the dollar's dominance. Energy markets are shifting. Digital money is rising. Oil is no longer the only fuel nations depend on. The question now isn't how the petrodollar works, it's how long it can survive. That story belongs to the final chapter. For nearly 50 years, the petrodollar has been the quiet engine of American power, the invisible architecture behind global trade, global finance, and global military reach. But every system built on a secret deal eventually reaches a moment of reckoning. And today, the petrodollar system stands at the edge of its most dangerous test, because the world is changing. And oil, once the undisputed king of resources, is losing its throne. The first threat is China. Unlike the 1970s, China isn't a helpless energy importer. It's the world's second largest economy, the biggest oil buyer on Earth, and it no longer wants to pay in dollars. Beijing is building a parallel financial universe, yuan-based oil contracts, digital currency networks, and alliances with oil producers like Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. For the first time in half a century, a rival currency has stepped onto the energy stage. The second threat is BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are no longer peripheral economies. They're a bloc representing more than 40% of humanity. They're exploring alternative reserve currencies, shared payment systems, and direct trade that bypasses the dollar entirely. What Spain learned with silver, America now learns with oil. No resource-based empire lasts forever. The third threat is technology. Electric cars, renewable energy, battery storage, nuclear revival, hydrogen development. Every innovation chips away at the world's dependence on oil, the very foundation of the petrodollar. The fourth threat is Saudi Arabia itself. The kingdom that helped create the system is no longer the same. Its Vision 2030 plan seeks independence, diversification, and new alliances. It trades with China in yuan. It negotiates with BRICS. It explores digital currencies. For the first time, Saudi Arabia is asking a question Washington hoped it never would. Does oil really need to be priced in dollars? And the final threat is the most dangerous: debt. America's modern economy is built on borrowing, on trillions in U.S. Treasury bonds bought by nations that need dollars for oil. If the world needs fewer dollars, it needs fewer U.S. bonds. And if demand for U.S. debt falls, America's entire financial engine, its deficits, its military spending, its global influence, begins to wobble. The petrodollar is not collapsing, but it is aging. It isn't dying, but it is vulnerable. And the world is quietly building alternatives, not because they want to dethrone the dollar, but because global power never stays in one place forever. The question that defined the 20th century was, how did the dollar become king? The question that may define the 21st century is, what happens when the world no longer needs the king? Because the petrodollar didn't just make America powerful, it made the world dependent. And when dependency shifts, so does power. The future won't be decided by oil or gold or even currency. It will be decided by whoever controls the next global necessity, and forces the world to pay for it in their terms.